The carriage jolted hard over a stone in the road, and Eleanor Ashworth gripped the seat with both hands, her knuckles turning white. Her heart was pounding, not from the bump in the road, but from the letter that sat folded in her lap, its wax seal already broken, its words already burned into her mind. The Duke of Kensmere wanted to meet her family. Not just her, all three sisters. Margaret sat across from her, fanning herself even though the morning air was cool, her eyes bright with excitement she could not hide. "He asked for all three of us," she said again, as if repeating it would make it feel less strange. Why would a duke ask for three sisters at once? Surely he already knows which one he wants to consider. Clara said nothing. She sat pressed into the corner of the carriage, her hands folded neatly over a small basket of mending she had brought to keep herself busy during the long ride. She was not thinking about dukes or invitations. She was thinking about the hem of her mother's blue dress, which had come loose again, and whether she would have time to fix it before they arrived. Their mother, Lady Ashworth, sat beside Margaret, her posture perfectly straight, her chin lifted with the kind of pride that came from years of practice. "This is the chance we have been waiting for," she said. "The Duke of Kensmere has not received guests in 3 years, not since his father passed. Everyone in London believed he would never marry, and now, out of nowhere, he sends for us." "For all three of us," Eleanor repeated, and there was an edge in her voice now, something sharper than excitement. She did not like uncertainty. She did not like not knowing which sister he had in mind, if he had one in mind at all. Eleanor liked plans. She liked knowing the outcome before the race had even begun. "Perhaps he simply wants to be polite," Clara offered quietly, not looking up from her mending. "Perhaps he does not wish to choose one sister over another, without meeting the whole family first." Eleanor turned to her, surprised, as if she had forgotten Clara was even in the carriage. "And what would you know of it?" she said, though not unkindly. It was simply a fact, spoken the way one might state the weather. Clara knew nothing of dukes and courtships. She had never been asked to a formal dance, had never been fitted for a gown meant to catch a gentleman's eye, had never once been considered part of the competition for a husband. She was the youngest, the quiet one, the sister who mended dresses instead of wearing them to balls. "I only meant," Clara said softly, "that a man who has avoided company for 3 years might simply be cautious. That is all." Lady Ashworth reached over and patted Clara's knee, the gesture kind, but distracted. "You may come along to keep your sister's company, dear. There is no need to trouble yourself with what the Duke does or does not think. Just remember to stay out of the way when it matters, and to help where you are needed." Clara nodded and returned to her mending. She was used to this. She had grown up standing slightly behind her sisters, slightly to the side, always present but never quite seen. It did not sting the way it once had, when she was younger, and still hoped that someone might notice her, the way they noticed Eleanor's sharp wit, or Margaret's easy laughter. She had long since made peace with her place in the family. She was the helper, the quiet one, the sister who noticed when a candle needed trimming, or when a guest's tea had gone cold, and who fixed it without being asked. The carriage rolled on for hours, the countryside slowly changing, from the familiar hedgerows near their own small estate, to grander, wilder land, thick forests giving way to open fields, and finally, as the sun began to lower in the sky, the towers of Kensmere Hall rose in the distance, like something out of a story. Margaret pressed her face nearly to the window. "It's enormous," she breathed. "Look at the size of it. I have never seen a house so large in all my life." Even Eleanor, who prided herself on never showing too much emotion, leaned forward to look. The hall was built of pale gray stone, with towers on either end, and rows of tall windows that caught the last light of the day and turned to gold. Gardens stretched out on both sides, trimmed with a precision that suggested an army of gardeners, and a long gravel drive curved up to the entrance, where a row of footmen already stood waiting. Clara looked too, though she said nothing. The house was beautiful, yes, but what struck her most was how quiet it seemed. No music drifted from open windows, no laughter carried across the lawns. For a house so grand, it felt strangely still, as though it had been waiting a long time for something, or someone, to bring it back to life. The carriage came to a stop, and a footman opened the door, offering his hand first to Lady Ashworth, then to Eleanor, then to Margaret. Clara climbed down last, smoothing her plain gray traveling dress, aware of how it looked beside her sister's finer gowns. though she had stopped minding such comparisons long ago. A tall man in dark clothing approached them, his expression composed but not unfriendly. "Welcome to Kensmere Hall," he said. "I am Henry, the head steward. His Grace asks that you rest and refresh yourselves before dinner. Please, follow me." They were led through a grand entrance hall, with a ceiling so high, it seemed to disappear into shadow, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and up a wide staircase, to a hallway lined with doors. Eleanor and Margaret were given rooms beside each other, both large and richly furnished, with views of the front gardens. Clara's room was smaller, tucked at the end of the hall, though still finer than anything she had at home. She did not mind. She set her small bag on the bed and moved to the window, looking down at the gardens below, where a lone gardener was still trimming a hedge despite the fading light. At dinner that evening, the family gathered in a dining room that could have comfortably seated 40 people, though only 6 places had been set. Lady Ashworth had positioned Eleanor and Margaret carefully, one on each side of where the Duke would sit, leaving Clara at the far end of the table, near their father, who had said little the entire journey, and seemed content to remain quiet through dinner as well. Sebastian Hargrove was not what Eleanor had expected. She had imagined someone older, perhaps, or someone with the soft, indulgent look of a man who had never wanted for anything. Instead, he was younger than she had guessed, perhaps 30, with dark hair and a serious, watchful face. He moved through the room without hurry, greeting Lord and Lady Ashworth with polite formality, then turning to the sisters. "Miss Ashworth," he said to Eleanor, with a small bow. "Miss Margaret Ashworth," he said, turning to Margaret, who dropped into a graceful curtsy. Then his gaze moved further down the table, to where Clara stood quietly near her chair. "And you must be Miss Clara," he said. "Yes, Your Grace," Clara replied, curtsying properly, though there was no particular warmth or interest in his voice when he said her name. It was simply courtesy, the kind extended to every guest at a table, and Clara did not expect anything more than that. Dinner began, and true to her nature, Eleanor took command of the conversation almost immediately. She spoke of the recent changes to trade policy, of a book she had read on estate management, of the improvements her own father had made to their land in the past year. She spoke clearly and confidently, clearly hoping to demonstrate that she was not merely decorative, that she understood the world of business and land that a man in the Duke's position would need in a wife. The Duke listened politely, nodding at the appropriate moments, offering brief responses that were thoughtful, but gave little away. Margaret, not to be outdone, waited for a pause, and then filled it with charm. She told a story about a ball in London, where a gentleman had tripped over his own feet, trying to bow to 3 ladies at once, and her laughter was so easy and genuine that even the Duke's stern face relaxed into the faintest smile. Clara, seated far down the table, said almost nothing. She noticed, though, the small things. She noticed when the footman refilling the wine glasses nearly overfilled the Duke's, and how the Duke did not seem to mind, simply moving his glass slightly, to make it easier for the young man to correct his aim without embarrassment. She noticed when her father's soup grew cold because he was too polite to ask for it to be reheated, and she quietly caught the eye of a passing servant and asked, without drawing attention, whether the soup might be warmed again. She noticed, too, the way the Duke's eyes moved briefly to her end of the table when she made that small request, though she did not think much of it at the time. She assumed he was simply observing the room, the way any host might glance around to make sure his guests were comfortable. After dinner, the family retired to a drawing room, where Lady Ashworth suggested a game of cards, hoping to give Eleanor and Margaret further opportunity to display their skills of conversation and wit. Clara excused herself early, claiming tiredness from the journey, though in truth, she simply preferred not to sit at a table where she was not expected to speak. She wandered instead toward a smaller sitting room she had noticed near the base of the stairs, drawn by the quiet and the soft light of a single lamp left burning. She did not expect to find anyone there, and so she was startled when she stepped through the doorway and found the Duke himself standing near the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. "Forgive me," Clara said quickly, stepping back. "I did not know this room was occupied. I will leave you in peace." "There is no need to leave," the Duke said, turning to look at her. "This house has 40 rooms, and more, Miss Clara. There is space enough for both of us to sit quietly, if that is what we wish." Clara hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or go. There was something in his tone that surprised her. a kind of tiredness that had not been present at dinner, when he had been performing the role of gracious host. "You do not care for cards," he said, not quite a question. "I do not mind them," Clara said. "I simply thought my sisters might prefer the room without me in it. I am not very good at conversation." The Duke studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That is an unusual thing to admit." "It is only the truth," Clara said simply. "I have always found it easier to notice what needs doing than to think of clever things to say. My sisters are much better suited to evenings like this." "Perhaps," the Duke said, though something in his voice suggested he was not entirely convinced. "Or perhaps you simply notice different things than they do." Clara did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and after a moment, she excused herself properly and returned to her room, leaving the Duke alone once more, with the quiet and the darkened gardens beyond the glass. She thought little of the conversation as she prepared for bed, assuming it had been nothing more than polite words exchanged between strangers. She did not know that the Duke remained in that small sitting room for a long while after she had gone, turning over her words in his mind, comparing them without meaning to against the practiced charm of the evening's dinner conversation. He had spent 3 years avoiding rooms full of hopeful young women and their ambitious mothers, tired of conversations that felt rehearsed, of smiles that seemed measured for effect. He had almost refused to send the invitation to the Ashworth family at all. But something about the quiet sister at the end of the table, the one who had asked for warm soup without drawing attention to herself, who had slipped out of the drawing room rather than compete for his notice, had caught his attention in a way he had not expected. He did not yet know what to make of it, but as he finally turned from the window and made his way toward his own chambers, he found himself thinking not of Eleanor's confident opinions on trade, nor of Margaret's easy laughter, but of the quiet honesty in Clara's simple admission that she was not very good at conversation. It was, he thought, the first entirely truthful thing anyone had said to him in a very long time. Morning at Kensmere Hall began with a knock so sharp that Clara sat upright in bed before she was fully awake. A young maid entered, apologizing quickly, explaining that Lady Ashworth had requested all 3 sisters be dressed and ready within the hour, as the Duke had arranged a tour of the grounds before breakfast. Clara dressed quickly, choosing a simple dress the color of dried lavender, and made her way downstairs, where she found Eleanor already waiting near the entrance hall, adjusting her gloves with quick, precise movements. "He wishes to show us the grounds," Eleanor said, not quite looking at Clara, her mind clearly already working through what such a gesture might mean. "A house this size, land this large, and he chooses to walk it with us on the very first morning. That is not nothing, Clara. A man does not waste his time on guests he has no interest in." "Perhaps he simply enjoys walking," Clara said. Eleanor gave her a brief, unreadable look, the kind she often gave Clara when she said something that did not fit neatly into Eleanor's understanding of how the world worked. "You have a strange way of seeing things," she said, though there was no real unkindness in it, only the particular exasperation of an older sister who had never quite understood the younger one. Margaret arrived a moment later, breathless and lovely, in a pale green dress that matched her eyes, and the 3 of them, along with their mother, were led out through the tall front doors into the cool morning air. The Duke was waiting near the gardens, dressed plainly for a man of his station, in a simple dark coat with no ornamentation. He greeted them with the same polite formality as the evening before, though Clara thought she noticed something slightly different in the way he looked at her, a brief flicker of attention that passed so quickly she was not certain she had not imagined it. "I thought you might like to see the gardens while the morning light is still soft," he said, addressing the group but glancing, Clara noticed, toward Lady Ashworth first, as courtesy demanded. "My mother designed much of this garden many years ago. It has not changed a great deal since." They walked along a gravel path bordered by rose bushes not yet in full bloom, the Duke pointing out various sections of the garden with quiet pride. Eleanor walked close beside him, asking pointed questions about the size of the estate, the number of tenant farms, the income generated from the surrounding land. She asked with the confidence of someone who had studied such matters carefully, hoping to demonstrate that she understood the responsibilities that would come with such a marriage. The Duke answered her questions thoroughly, clearly respecting the seriousness behind them, though his responses remained measured, giving away little of his own thoughts. Margaret, walking on his other side, filled the quieter moments with lighter conversation, commenting on the beauty of the flowers, asking playful questions about which parts of the garden had been his favorite as a boy. She had a gift for making people smile, and more than once the Duke's serious expression softened at something she said. Clara walked a little behind the group, alongside her mother, who seemed content to simply admire the scenery and occasionally comment on the fineness of the hedges. Clara found herself noticing small details the others seemed to overlook. A section of the garden wall, where the stone had begun to crumble. A rose bush that had not been pruned properly and was growing wild in one direction. A young gardener, working alone, near the far end of the path, who kept glancing nervously toward the group, as though worried he might be in the way. When they reached a small stone bridge crossing a narrow stream, the group paused to admire the view. Eleanor was in the middle of describing a particular method of crop rotation she had read about, and Margaret was laughing at something the Duke had said, when Clara noticed the young gardener again, now closer, struggling to carry a heavy wooden crate of tools along a path that had become slick with morning dew. Without thinking much about it, Clara stepped away from the group and moved toward him. "Might I help you with that?" she said quietly. "The path looks slippery just there." The young man, startled to be addressed by one of the guests, shook his head quickly. "No, miss, I couldn't ask that of you. It's no trouble, truly." "It is no trouble for me either," Clara said, and before he could protest further, she had taken hold of one side of the crate, helping to steady it as he navigated the slick stone. Once they had passed the difficult section, she released her grip and smiled. "There, much easier with two." The young gardener thanked her, clearly flustered, and hurried off toward the tool shed, glancing back once with an expression of surprised gratitude. Clara turned back toward the group, expecting no one to have noticed the small exchange, and was startled to find the Duke watching her, his expression thoughtful. Eleanor and Margaret had not seen. They were still engaged in conversation, Eleanor gesturing toward a distant field as she continued her point about crop rotation. But the Duke had seen. He had watched the entire exchange, and something in his face suggested he was turning it over in his mind, the same way he had turned over her words from the night before. Clara felt her cheeks warm and quickly rejoined the group, saying nothing about what had happened, assuming it was too small a thing to mention. The walk continued for another hour, through a small orchard, past a greenhouse filled with delicate flowers, and finally back toward the house, where breakfast had been laid out on a long table in a sunlit room overlooking the gardens. Eleanor and Margaret continued their efforts throughout the meal, each finding moments to draw the Duke's attention, each certain that her particular approach, whether intelligence or charm, was surely making the stronger impression. Clara ate quietly, listening more than speaking, occasionally offering small observations when directly addressed, but otherwise content to remain in the background. She noticed, as she often did, the small imperfections in the room that no one else seemed to see. A crooked painting on the far wall, a chipped edge on one of the serving dishes, a servant who seemed nervous and new to his role, dropping a spoon and flushing red with embarrassment before quickly retrieving it. When the young servant fumbled a second time, nearly spilling a pitcher of cream across the table, Clara caught his eye gently and gave a small, reassuring nod, the kind of look that said, "It is only cream, no one will remember this by supper." The young man visibly relaxed, and the rest of the meal passed without further incident. Once again, the Duke noticed. He said nothing of it at breakfast, continuing to engage with Eleanor's questions about estate matters and Margaret's lighter conversation. But later that day, when the sisters had retired to their rooms to rest before the evening's activities, he found himself walking the halls of his own house with unusual restlessness, thinking not of the confident answers Eleanor had given about crop rotation, nor of the easy laughter Margaret had drawn from him in the garden, but of the quiet, unremarkable kindness he had witnessed twice now, from the sister, who seemed to want nothing from him at all. He mentioned it, almost without meaning to his steward Henry, as the two men reviewed the week's schedule that afternoon in the study. "The youngest sister," the Duke said, not quite looking up from the papers on his desk. "Miss Clara, has she said anything to you, or to any of the staff, about her impressions of the house?" Henry, who had served the family for many years and had a habit of noticing things others missed, allowed himself a small, knowing smile, before quickly composing his expression back to its usual neutrality. "She has been quite kind to the staff, Your Grace, if I may say so. One of the kitchen maids mentioned that Miss Clara thanked her personally for the extra blanket brought to her room last night. Most guests do not think to thank the person who brings the blanket. They simply expect it to appear. The Duke said nothing for a long moment, his eyes returning to the papers in front of him, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. "Thank you, Henry," he said finally. "That will be all." That evening, dinner proceeded much as it had the night before, with Eleanor and Margaret each working diligently to secure the Duke's attention, and Clara remaining largely silent, content to observe rather than participate. But this time, Clara noticed something new. Once or twice during the meal, she caught the Duke glancing toward her end of the table, not with the polite, distant courtesy of a host checking on his guests, but with something more curious, more searching. She told herself she was imagining it. Surely, a man in his position, with two accomplished and beautiful sisters vying openly for his attention, had no reason to spare a second thought for the quiet one who mended dresses and asked for warm soup. And yet, when their eyes met briefly across the long table, Clara felt an unfamiliar flutter of uncertainty, quickly followed by embarrassment at her own foolishness for imagining such a thing might mean anything at all. After dinner, as the family once again gathered for cards, Clara excused herself early, as she had the night before, and made her way toward the small sitting room near the base of the stairs, half expecting, half hoping, that she might find it empty this time. It was not empty. The Duke stood near the same window as before, though this time he turned toward the door before she had even fully entered, as though he had been listening for footsteps. "Miss Clara," he said, and there was something warmer in his voice now than there had been the night before. "I wondered if you might come this way again." Clara paused in the doorway, uncertain how to respond to such an admission. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I did not mean to disturb you a second time." "You are not disturbing me," he said. "I find I much prefer this room, and this conversation, to the one taking place with the cards." Clara stepped further into the room, though she remained near the door, unsure of the boundaries of such an unusual friendship, if that was even what this was. "You are very kind to say so, Your Grace, though I imagine my sisters offer far more interesting company than I do." "Your sisters are clever and charming," the Duke said, choosing his words carefully. "They would make excellent company for many men, but I find myself curious about the sister who says the least and yet seems to see the most." Clara did not know how to answer that, so for a long moment she said nothing at all, and the silence between them, rather than feeling awkward, felt strangely comfortable, the kind of quiet that did not need to be filled with words to feel complete. By the third day at Kensmere Hall, a quiet tension had begun to settle over the household, one that none of the family members spoke of directly, though everyone seemed to feel it. Eleanor had grown more determined, spending long hours preparing her conversation topics for the evening, choosing her words with the same precision she might use in planning a business venture. Margaret had become slightly more anxious beneath her usual charm, laughing a touch too readily, watching the Duke's reactions a touch too closely. Lady Ashworth, for her part, had begun to notice something she could not quite name, a pattern in the way the Duke's eyes moved during meals, lingering not on her two elder daughters, whom she had brought to this house with such careful hope, but occasionally, briefly, on Clara, who sat quietly at the far end of the table as she always did. She said nothing of it at first, dismissing the thought as foolishness. Surely a Duke would not overlook two accomplished young women in favor of the youngest, the quietest, the one who had never been groomed for such attention, and yet the thought lingered, uncomfortable and persistent, until finally, on the afternoon of the third day, she drew Clara aside in the hallway outside her room. "Clara," she said, her voice low, "I wish to speak with you plainly. I know you have not been raised to think of yourself as part of this courtship. That was never the intention in bringing you here, but I have noticed the Duke's attention wandering in your direction more than once, and I want to understand why." Clara felt her face flush with surprise and embarrassment. "Mother, I have done nothing to draw his attention. I promise you that. I have only tried to stay out of the way, as you asked." "I do not doubt that," Lady Ashworth said, studying her youngest daughter carefully. "But staying out of the way and drawing no attention are two very different things, and it seems you have managed the first without quite achieving the second." "I do not understand what you wish me to do," Clara said honestly. "Should I make myself less helpful? Should I stop noticing when something is amiss?" Lady Ashworth was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had softened. "No," she said slowly, as though the thought were only now taking shape in her mind. I do not think I wish that at all. I think perhaps, I simply want you to understand what is happening, so that whatever comes of it, you are not caught unprepared. Clara did not know what to say to that, and so she said nothing, retreating quietly to her room to think over her mother's words. Though she found she could make little sense of them, she did not believe, truly believe, that a man like the Duke of Kensmere could have any serious interest in someone like her. It seemed far more likely that he was simply a polite man, attentive to all his guests in turn, and that her mother's imagination had gotten ahead of the facts. That afternoon, the family was invited to join the Duke for a ride through the eastern part of the estate, where he wished to show them a small lake bordered by willow trees that had been a favorite spot of his mother's many years before. Eleanor rode confidently beside him, discussing the merits of the land for potential agricultural use, while Margaret rode nearby, offering lighter commentary and occasional laughter. Clara, who had little skill or confidence on horseback, rode more cautiously toward the back of the group, accompanied by a young stable hand who had been assigned to assist her if needed. As they crossed a shallow stream, her horse startled suddenly at the sound of a bird taking flight from the reeds, and Clara, caught off guard, nearly lost her balance in the saddle. Before the stable hand could reach her, the Duke had already turned his own horse and closed the distance, reaching out to steady her mount with a firm, practiced hand. "Easy now," he said, his voice calm, speaking as much to the horse as to Clara herself. "There is nothing to fear. The bird has already gone." Clara's heart was still racing, though whether from the sudden fright or from the Duke's swift response, she could not entirely say. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed. "I am afraid I am not a particularly skilled rider." "You did not fall," the Duke pointed out, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth. "That is more than many can claim after such a fright. You need not apologize for a moment of surprise." They rode side by side for the remainder of the crossing, the Duke keeping his pace slower to match hers, and though neither of them spoke much during that short distance, Clara found herself unexpectedly comfortable in his company, the earlier awkwardness of their conversations in the sitting room giving way to something steadier, something that felt less like a courtship and more like the beginning of an understanding between two people. Ahead of them, Eleanor glanced back and noticed the Duke had fallen behind to ride alongside Clara. Her expression, usually so composed, flickered briefly with something sharper, something closer to frustration, before she smoothed it away and turned her attention back to the conversation with Margaret, who had not yet noticed the shift. When they reached the lake, the group dismounted, and the Duke led them along the shoreline, pointing out the ancient willow trees that trailed their branches into the still water. Eleanor resumed her earlier conversation about the estate's potential, clearly determined not to let the moment at the stream diminish her efforts. Margaret found a smooth, flat stone and skipped it across the surface of the lake with practiced ease, laughing when it bounced 4 times before sinking, and challenging the Duke to try to beat her count. He obliged, though his throw fell short, the stone sinking after only 2 bounces, and Margaret's triumphant laughter rang out across the water, drawing a genuine smile from him in return. Clara stood a little apart from the group, watching the willow branches sway gently in the breeze, content simply to observe the beauty of the place, without needing to compete for anyone's attention. She did not notice, at first, that the Duke had drifted away from Margaret's game and come to stand beside her. "You are quiet again," he said. "I am always quiet," Clara replied with a small smile. "You will find nothing new in that observation, Your Grace." "Perhaps not new," he agreed, "but I find I do not tire of noticing it all the same." He looked out at the water for a moment before continuing. "My mother used to bring me here when I was young. She would sit beneath that largest willow and read to me for hours, while my father was occupied with matters of the estate. After she passed, I found I could not come here for a very long time. It felt too quiet, too empty, without her voice filling the silence." Clara turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden openness of the admission. "And now," she asked gently, "does it still feel that way?" The Duke considered the question carefully before answering. "Today, less so," he said. "Today, the silence does not feel empty. It feels, strangely, rather peaceful." Neither of them said anything further on the matter, but Clara understood, in some quiet way she could not fully explain, that something had shifted between them in that moment, something small but significant, the beginning of a trust that had not existed even a day before. The ride back to the house was quieter than the ride out. The group's earlier energy settled into a comfortable, companionable silence. Eleanor and Margaret rode together near the front, discussing the events of the day in low voices, while Clara rode near the back once more, though this time the Duke chose to ride beside her rather than at the front of the group. A small change in position that neither Eleanor nor Margaret failed to notice, though neither said anything about it aloud. That evening, as the family prepared for dinner, Lady Ashworth found a quiet moment to speak with Eleanor, who had grown increasingly tense throughout the afternoon. "You must not let your worries show," she advised. "Whatever the Duke's private thoughts may be, nothing has been decided. There is still time to make your case." Eleanor nodded, though her jaw remained tight, and she spent the hour before dinner reviewing, once again, the arguments and observations she intended to raise, determined not to let the small shift at the lake discourage her from what she still believed was rightfully within her reach. Margaret, meanwhile, sat before her mirror, studying her own reflection with an unfamiliar uncertainty. She had always been confident in her ability to charm, to draw laughter and warmth from any room she entered. But something about the quiet moments she had witnessed between the Duke and Clara throughout the day had unsettled her in a way she did not fully understand, a small crack in the certainty she had carried since childhood, that she would always be the sister people noticed first. Clara, unaware of the quiet turmoil taking shape in her sisters' minds, dressed simply for dinner and made her way downstairs, thinking only of the peaceful moment by the lake, and wondering, with a small and unfamiliar flicker of hope she did not quite dare to acknowledge, whether the Duke might seek out that same quiet peace again before the evening was through. A storm rolled in on the fourth night, rattling the tall windows of Kensmere Hall and filling the halls with the low rumble of distant thunder. Clara woke well past midnight to the sound of raised voices somewhere below her room, faint but unmistakable, carrying up through the old stone walls. She lay still for a moment, telling herself it was none of her concern, before curiosity and a lifetime habit of tending to trouble finally pulled her from bed. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way quietly down the servants' staircase near her room, following the sound of voices toward the kitchens, where a single lamp still burned. There she found a young kitchen maid, no older than 16, sitting on a low stool with her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, while an older woman, the housekeeper, stood over her with a stern expression and crossed arms. "You have broken the good serving dish, Alice," the housekeeper was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "The one that belonged to His Grace's mother. Do you understand what that means? That dish cannot be replaced. It came from a set his mother chose herself, and now half of it lies in pieces on my floor." The young maid, Alice, only sobbed harder, too distressed to offer any defense of herself. Clara stepped into the doorway, and both women turned, startled to see one of the guests standing there in her nightclothes. "Miss Clara," the housekeeper said quickly, straightening, "forgive us. We did not mean to disturb you. This is a household matter. Please, return to your room. I will see that the noise does not continue." "I am not disturbed," Clara said gently, moving further into the kitchen. "I only wondered if I might help. What has happened here?" The housekeeper hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing the matter in front of a guest, but Alice, still crying, spoke up between her sobs. "It slipped from my hands, miss. Truly it did. I was reaching for the shelf above, and my foot caught on the step stool, and I could not stop myself in time. I did not mean it. I promise you I did not mean it." Clara knelt beside the girl, ignoring the housekeeper's look of mild alarm at seeing a guest lower herself to the level of a servant. "Accidents happen to everyone," Clara said softly. "I have broken far more dishes than I care to admit, back at home. It does not make you careless. It only makes you human." "But it was his mother's," Alice whispered. "The housekeeper says, His Grace treasures anything that belonged to her. I fear I shall lose my position over this." Clara considered this for a moment, then turned to the housekeeper. "Might I see the remaining pieces?" The housekeeper, still uncertain, but unwilling to refuse a guest's request, gestured toward a cloth on the table, where the broken pieces of the dish had been carefully gathered. Clara examined them closely, turning the largest fragments over in her hands, studying the pattern of delicate blue flowers painted along the rim. "This break is clean," Clara said finally. "See here, along this edge. A skilled hand with the right materials could mend this so the crack would barely show. I have done such repairs before, on pieces at home that my mother could not bear to part with. It will not be as it was, but it need not be thrown away entirely. The housekeeper looked skeptical, but something in Clara's calm confidence seemed to ease her earlier anger. You would know how to mend porcelain, miss. I have taught myself a great many small skills over the years, Clara said simply. If you will allow it, I would be glad to try. In the morning, when there is proper light to work by. And in the meantime, I do not think Alice should lose her position over an honest accident. Everyone stumbles now and then. The housekeeper studied Clara for a long moment, then finally sighed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Very well, miss. I will hold my judgment until morning, and we shall see what can be done with the pieces. She turned to Alice, her voice softening slightly. Go and wash your face, girl, and get some rest. We will speak no more of this tonight. Alice thanked Clara through fresh tears of relief, and Clara offered her a warm smile before making her way back toward the staircase, satisfied that the matter, at least for tonight, had been resolved. She did not know that the Duke, unable to sleep because of the storm, had been standing in the shadows of the hallway above the kitchen stairs, drawn down by the same raised voices that had woken Clara. He had heard the entire exchange, had watched through the partly open door as Clara knelt beside a distressed servant girl in the middle of the night, offering comfort and a practical solution, without ever once mentioning her own comfort or the lateness of the hour. He remained in the shadows until Clara had passed back up the stairs toward her room, and only then did he step into the kitchen himself, causing both the housekeeper and Alice to startle and rise quickly from their seats. Forgive us. We did not know you were still awake. There is nothing to forgive, the Duke said. I heard what happened. The dish was an accident, nothing more. And I have no wish for anyone in this house to lose their position over broken porcelain, however dear it may have been to my mother's memory. He paused, glancing toward the cloth where the broken pieces still lay. Miss Clara offered to mend it, I understand. She did, Your Grace, the housekeeper confirmed. She was very kind about it, knelt right down beside young Alice here, as though she were not a guest at all. The Duke nodded slowly, something thoughtful settling over his expression. Yes, he said quietly, almost to himself. That does sound like her. He left the kitchen, without further comment, but he did not return immediately to his own chambers. Instead, he found himself walking the long gallery on the second floor, past the portraits of his ancestors, past the closed door of his mother's old sitting room, which he rarely entered, thinking over everything he had witnessed in the past 4 days. Eleanor had impressed him with her intelligence, her grasp of matters that many women were never taught to consider. Margaret had charmed him with her warmth and her laughter, reminding him of a lightness he had nearly forgotten how to feel. But it was Clara, quiet, unassuming Clara, who continued to reveal herself in these small, unguarded moments. Moments she never intended for him to witness. Moments that showed him not a performance crafted for his benefit, but the true, steady character of a woman who was kind, simply because kindness was who she was, not because she hoped to gain anything by it. He thought of his own mother then, of the quiet strength she had carried through difficult years with his father, of the way she had never sought attention for her kindness, but had simply offered it, again and again, to anyone who needed it. He had not realized, until this moment, how much he had missed that particular quality in the women he had met over the past several years. Women who had been taught, quite reasonably, that a duke's attention was won through cleverness and charm, never suspecting that what he truly longed for was something far simpler and far rarer. The following morning, Clara kept her promise, working carefully in a quiet corner of the drawing room to mend the broken porcelain dish, using a delicate paste the housekeeper had provided, and a steady hand that came from years of practice mending things at home that her family could not afford to replace. Eleanor and Margaret, occupied elsewhere with preparations for the afternoon's planned outing, did not know where their sister had disappeared to, and Clara did not think to mention it, considering it too small a matter to be worth discussing. The Duke found her there an hour later, bent over the delicate pieces with an expression of complete concentration, a small dab of paste on her fingertip, entirely unaware that he had entered the room and was watching her from the doorway. You need not have troubled yourself with this, he said finally, and Clara looked up, startled. It was no trouble, she said. I am nearly finished. See here, the crack is barely visible now, and once it is dried fully, I do not think anyone would notice unless they looked very closely. The Duke crossed the room and knelt beside the small table where she worked, examining the repair with genuine interest. "You have done this well," he said, "better than I would have expected." "I have had a great deal of practice," Clara said with a small, self-deprecating smile. "Ours is not a household with money to spare for replacing what can instead be repaired." The Duke was quiet for a moment, studying not the dish, but Clara herself, the careful, unhurried way she worked, the complete absence of any expectation that her efforts should be noticed or praised. "Miss Clara," he said finally, "may I ask you something honestly?" "Of course, Your Grace." "Why do you do these things? The dish, the girl in the kitchen last night, the gardener with his crate of tools. You seek no credit for any of it. You do not even mention it unless I happen to discover it myself. Why trouble yourself at all, when no one would think less of you for simply looking away?" Clara considered the question seriously before answering, setting down the small piece of porcelain she had been holding. "I suppose," she said slowly, "it has never occurred to me to look away. When I see something that needs doing, and I am able to do it, it feels strange not to. It is not a virtue I am trying to display, Your Grace. It is simply how I have always been." The Duke said nothing for a long moment, but something in his expression, some quiet warmth that had not been there when he first entered the room, told Clara that her answer, simple as it was, had meant something to him far greater than she understood. By the 5th afternoon, Lady Ashworth had arranged for the family to take tea in the small private sitting room that had, over the course of the week, become a quiet favorite of the household. It was meant to be a simple, informal gathering, an opportunity for the Duke to relax in more intimate company, before the more formal dinner planned for that evening. Eleanor and Margaret had both dressed with particular care, each hoping that this smaller setting, without the distraction of a full table and formal courses, might offer a clearer chance to secure the Duke's favor. But fate, as it often does, intervened in a small and unremarkable way. Just as the tea service was being carried into the room, one of the younger footmen slipped on the polished floor near the doorway, and Margaret's favorite gown, a delicate cream silk she had chosen specifically for this occasion, caught against a loose thread on a nearby chair, and tore along the hem with an audible rip. Margaret gasped, more from surprise than distress, but the damage was clear, a long tear running nearly a foot along the bottom of the gown. "Oh, this is dreadful," she said, examining the fabric with growing dismay. "I have no time to change before tea begins." Lady Ashworth, ever practical in a crisis, took charge immediately. "Eleanor, come help your sister. We must find her something else to wear at once." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before nodding and following Margaret from the room, both sisters hurrying upstairs to find a suitable replacement gown, leaving Clara, who had been quietly arranging the tea things at the housekeeper's request, alone in the sitting room when the Duke arrived a few minutes later. He paused in the doorway, glancing around the empty room with mild surprise. "Miss Clara, I had expected to find your sisters here as well." "There has been a small accident with Margaret's gown," Clara explained, continuing her careful arrangement of the tea service. "They will join us shortly, once she has changed. I hope you do not mind waiting a few moments." "Not at all," the Duke said, taking a seat near the small table. "It seems I have found myself once again in a quiet room with you, rather than a crowded one. I am beginning to think fate has a particular fondness for arranging such moments." Clara smiled slightly at that but said nothing, continuing to pour the tea with practiced, careful movements. She had noticed, over the past several days, small details about the Duke's preferences that she had never been asked to notice, things she had simply observed without meaning to, that he took his tea with only a small amount of sugar, no more than half a spoonful, and no milk at all, unlike most gentlemen of his rank, who preferred it heavily sweetened and pale. She had heard him mention it once, briefly, almost as an aside during dinner on the second night, and she had remembered it without ever intending to. She prepared his cup exactly as she recalled, setting it before him without comment, and continued preparing the rest of the tea service for when her sisters and mother would arrive. The Duke lifted the cup, took a sip, and paused, looking at her with an expression of genuine surprise. "This is precisely how I take it," he said. "Half a spoon of sugar, no milk. I do not believe I have mentioned that to anyone since I arrived at this house this season. How did you know?" Clara looked up, faintly embarrassed to have been caught in what felt, suddenly, like an unusually intimate observation. "You mentioned it once, at dinner, the first evening we arrived. I do not know why I remembered it. I suppose I simply pay attention to such small things, without always meaning to." The Duke set down his cup slowly, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, something between wonder and quiet realization. "You remembered a passing comment I made nearly a week ago, about something as unimportant as sugar in my tea," he said. "Do you know, Miss Clara, in all my life, I do not believe anyone has ever paid me that particular kind of attention. Not because they wished to impress me, but simply because they were listening, truly listening, without any purpose behind it at all." Clara did not know how to respond to such a statement, and for a moment, silence settled comfortably between them, the kind of silence that no longer felt uncertain, but instead felt strangely full, as though words were unnecessary to convey what was passing between them. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" Clara said finally, breaking the quiet. "Of course. Why have you avoided company these past 3 years? I do not ask to pry. I only wonder, because you do not seem, to me, like a man who dislikes people. You seem, rather, like a man who has grown tired of a particular kind of attention." The Duke considered the question for a long moment before answering, turning his teacup slowly in his hands. "You are more perceptive than you give yourself credit for," he said. "After my father passed, and I inherited this title, I found myself surrounded, quite suddenly, by a great many people who seemed very interested in my company, my title, and my land, and rather less interested in anything about myself as a man. Every conversation felt like a performance. Every kindness felt calculated, toward some hoped-for advantage. I grew weary of trying to determine which version of a person's affection was genuine and which was simply strategy, and eventually, it seemed easier to avoid the question entirely by avoiding company altogether. "That sounds very lonely," Clara said softly. "It was," the Duke admitted. "Though I had grown so accustomed to it, I had nearly forgotten to notice the loneliness at all, until this past week." He looked at her directly then, his expression open, in a way it had not been since her arrival. "You have not once asked me about my title, or my land, or my income, Miss Clara. In 7 days, you have asked me nothing of the sort. I find that, more than anything else, has been the thing I have valued most about your company." Clara felt her cheeks warm under the weight of his gaze, uncertain how to respond to such an admission. "I suppose I have never known how to ask such questions," she said honestly. "I have never been taught to think of myself as someone who might be part of this particular kind of conversation." "Perhaps," the Duke said quietly. "That is precisely why I find I wish to include you in it." Before Clara could formulate any response to such a statement, the door opened, and Eleanor and Margaret returned. Margaret now dressed in a fresh gown of pale blue, slightly breathless from the hurried change, but composed once more. The moment shifted immediately, the private quiet between Clara and the Duke giving way to the familiar rhythm of group conversation, Eleanor inquiring politely about whether they had kept the Duke waiting too long, Margaret apologizing prettily for the delay. The Duke rose to greet them with his usual courtesy, the openness that had colored his conversation with Clara only moments before folding neatly back into practiced formality. But Clara, watching him carefully, noticed that his eyes returned to her more than once throughout the remainder of the tea, and she found herself, for the first time since arriving at Kensmere Hall, daring to wonder whether her mother's earlier words might carry more truth than she had allowed herself to believe. That evening, as the sisters prepared for dinner, Eleanor found a moment alone with Margaret in the hallway between their rooms. "Something is different," Eleanor said, her voice low and careful. "I do not know what happened this afternoon, while we were dealing with your gown, but something has shifted." The Duke looks at Clara differently now. Margaret's expression tightened slightly, though she tried to keep her voice light. "You are imagining things, Eleanor. He has always been polite to all of us equally." "I am not imagining it," Eleanor said firmly. "I have spent this entire week studying that man's every expression, every word, searching for some sign of where his true interest lies, and I am telling you, sister, something has changed. We cannot simply continue as we have been. We must think carefully about how to proceed." Margaret said nothing for a long moment, staring at her own reflection in the small mirror hanging in the hallway, and for the first time since their arrival, a flicker of genuine worry crossed her face. Worry, not born of competition, but of something closer to fear. The fear that the quiet sister neither of them had ever considered a rival might, somehow, without ever trying, have already won a contest they had not even realized they were losing. The sixth day brought with it a change in the household routine, as Lady Ashworth, sensing that time was growing short and that some final impression must be secured, arranged for a small dinner party to be held that evening, inviting several neighboring families to join them at Kensmere Hall. It would be, she reasoned, a chance for the Duke to observe her daughters in wider company, to see how each of them conducted herself among strangers, which she considered the truest test of a woman's readiness to manage a household of such standing. Eleanor welcomed the challenge eagerly, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate her social skill before a larger audience. Margaret, though slightly more anxious than usual after the events of the previous afternoon, resolved to charm the gathered guests with even greater effort than before. Clara, upon hearing of the plans, felt only a quiet dread, knowing that a room full of strangers would require exactly the kind of performance she had never learned to give. The guests began arriving in the late afternoon, a mixture of local gentry, eager for a rare glimpse inside Kensmere Hall, and a chance to meet the reclusive Duke's potential brides. Among them was a particularly sharp-tongued woman named Margaret Whitmore, no relation to the Ashworth family despite the shared name, who had a reputation in the county for her clever, often cutting remarks, and her elderly aunt, a formidable woman named Mrs. Pembroke, who missed very little and forgave even less. The evening began well enough. Eleanor engaged several of the gentlemen present in spirited discussion about matters of local governance, impressing more than one guest with her clear grasp of complicated issues. Margaret moved gracefully through the gathered crowd, drawing laughter and admiration wherever she went, her natural warmth putting even the most reserved guests at ease. Clara, as always, found a quiet corner near the refreshment table, content to assist the servants where needed, and to speak only when directly addressed. She refilled glasses that had gone empty, noticed when the fire needed tending, and quietly signaled a footman to attend to it, and generally moved through the gathering like a helpful shadow, present but unremarked upon. It was during a lull in the evening's conversation that Mrs. Pembroke, the sharp-eyed aunt, found herself seated near Clara, and decided, with the particular boldness of the very old, to address her directly. "You are the youngest Ashworth girl, are you not?" the old woman said, studying Clara through narrowed eyes. "The quiet one. I have been watching you all evening, and you have said perhaps 10 words the entire time, while your sisters have said several thousand between them." Clara felt her face warm under the woman's direct scrutiny. "I suppose that is true, ma'am. I have never had much talent for conversation in large gatherings." "Nonsense," Mrs. Pembroke said briskly. "You have simply never been given reason to believe your words mattered as much as your sisters. That is a very different thing from lacking talent." She studied Clara a moment longer. "Tell me, girl, what do you think of this house? Not the polite answer you would give your mother. The true answer." Clara hesitated, surprised by the directness of the question, but something about the old woman's frank manner made honesty feel not only possible, but somehow expected. "I think," Clara said slowly, "that it is a beautiful house that has been very lonely for a very long time. I think the gardens are cared for with great love, but the rooms themselves have felt, until recently, as though they were waiting for someone to fill them with life again." Mrs. Pembroke's sharp eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, she said nothing at all, simply studying Clara with renewed interest. "That," she said finally, "is the most honest thing I have heard spoken in this house, in a very long time. Most young women who come through these doors speak only of the house's grandeur, its value, what it might mean for their own standing to live within these walls. You are the first I have heard speak of its loneliness." Unbeknownst to either of them, the Duke had drawn near enough during the course of the conversation to overhear this final exchange, and he paused, several steps away, listening with an expression of quiet astonishment as Mrs. Pembroke continued to speak. "I knew your mother, you know," the old woman said to him as he approached, without missing a beat, as though she had known all along he was listening. "The old Duchess. She used to say much the same thing about this house, in her early years here, before she filled it with warmth of her own. It seems this girl has noticed something the rest of us have long forgotten to see." The Duke said nothing for a moment, his gaze moving to Clara, who looked suddenly mortified to have been overheard speaking so plainly about his family home. "Forgive me, your grace," she said quickly. I did not mean any disrespect. I only meant— You need not apologize, the Duke said, his voice gentler than Clara had expected. You have said nothing. I have not thought myself. Many times, though I have never heard anyone else give voice to it so clearly. Mrs. Pembroke, satisfied with the small drama she had orchestrated, rose from her seat with the aid of her cane and moved off toward another group of guests, leaving Clara and the Duke standing together near the edge of the gathering, the noise of the party continuing around them like a distant tide. I did not intend for anyone to hear that, Clara admitted quietly. I am glad someone did, the Duke replied. Miss Clara, might I ask you to walk with me for a moment, away from the noise? There is something I find myself wishing to discuss, and this room, full as it is, does not seem the place for it. Clara glanced briefly toward where her mother stood, deep in conversation with another guest, unaware of the request being made, and then nodded, allowing the Duke to lead her toward a set of doors that opened onto a quiet terrace overlooking the darkened gardens. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of roses from the beds below, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing together at the terrace railing, looking out over the grounds bathed in soft moonlight. I have spent this past week, the Duke said finally, trying to understand something about myself that I could not quite name. I invited your family here, believing I would meet 3 sisters, each hoping to become my wife, and that I would choose based on some careful weighing of accomplishment and suitability. I did not expect to find myself, instead, thinking of one sister in particular at every quiet moment of my day, wondering what small kindness she might have performed unnoticed, what honest observation she might make if I asked her opinion directly. Clara's heart began to beat faster, though she said nothing, afraid to interrupt whatever he was working to express. I do not yet know what this means, the Duke continued, or where it will lead. I have not spoken with your mother, and I do not wish to raise expectations before I have fully understood my own heart in this matter. But I did not want another day to pass without telling you, honestly, that you have changed something in me these past 6 days that I did not believe could still be changed. Clara turned to look at him fully then, her own uncertainty warring with a small, growing warmth she could no longer deny. Your Grace, she said carefully, I must be honest with you as well. I came to this house believing myself entirely outside this competition, believing I was here only to support my sisters, never once considering that I might be seen, truly seen, by anyone in this house, let alone by you. I do not know what to make of what has happened this week either, but I find I do not wish it to end, whatever it is. The Duke's expression softened into something Clara had not seen from him before, a quiet, unguarded warmth that seemed to erase, for just a moment, all the careful distance he had maintained since her arrival. Neither of them spoke further, the sounds of the party continuing faintly behind them, the moon casting soft light across the gardens below, as they stood together, in a silence that had, somewhere over the past 6 days, transformed from awkward to comfortable, to something that felt, unmistakably, like the quiet beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. News travels quickly in a house full of servants, no matter how quietly 2 people believe they are speaking, and by the following morning, a hushed rumor had already begun to move through the halls of Kensmere Hall, whispered between maids as they made the beds, murmured among footmen as they polished silver, that the Duke had been seen walking alone with the youngest Ashworth sister on the terrace during the previous night's dinner party, and that something in his manner toward her had changed entirely. It did not take long for the rumor to reach Eleanor, delivered carefully, and with visible discomfort by her own lady's maid, who had heard it from a housemaid while dressing Eleanor's hair that morning. Eleanor sat very still as the maid spoke, her expression carefully controlled, though her hands, resting in her lap, had curled into tight fists beneath the folds of her dressing gown. Thank you, Eleanor said finally, her voice steady, despite the storm building inside her. That will be all for now. Once alone, Eleanor rose and crossed to the window, staring out at the gardens without truly seeing them, her mind working through the implications of what she had just heard. She had spent this entire week preparing herself with the same discipline she applied to every important task in her life, studying, planning, positioning herself carefully at every opportunity, certain that intelligence and competence would ultimately prove more valuable than mere charm, or, worse, whatever quiet, unremarkable quality her youngest sister seemed to possess. She found Margaret a short while later in the breakfast room, picking at her food without much appetite, and it became clear from Margaret's own troubled expression that she, too, had already heard the rumor. "You have heard, then," Eleanor said, taking a seat across from her sister. Margaret nodded slowly. "My maid mentioned it while helping me dress. I did not want to believe it at first. Clara has never sought his attention, not once this entire week. She has barely spoken to him directly, from what I have seen." "That," Eleanor said bitterly, "may be precisely the reason he has noticed her." The two sisters sat in uncomfortable silence for a long moment, each turning over her own private disappointment, before Margaret finally spoke again. "What will we do?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, her sharp mind already working through possibilities, though something in her expression suggested a battle taking place beneath her usual composure. "We could continue as we have been," she said slowly. "Redouble our efforts, seek more opportunities to demonstrate our own merits. Or we could accept that we may have already lost something we did not even realize we were competing for until it was nearly gone." Margaret looked up, surprised by the resignation in her sister's voice. "That does not sound like you, Eleanor. You have never given up on anything in your life." "I am not giving up," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "I am simply beginning to wonder whether we were ever truly competing for the same thing Clara was offering, without even trying to offer it." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window again. "I have spent this entire week trying to prove I would make a capable duchess. I am not certain I ever once tried to show him who I truly am, apart from my accomplishments. I wonder now if that was the very thing he was searching for all along." Margaret said nothing, but her own thoughts mirrored her sister's, more closely than she cared to admit. She had built her entire approach to courtship around charm, around the easy warmth that had always won her admirers without effort, and it had not occurred to her, until this moment, that a man who had spent 3 years avoiding exactly that kind of practiced charm might be searching for something else entirely. Their mother found them there a short while later, her own expression tight with the same news that had already reached her daughters, though she had heard it not from a servant but directly from the Duke's aunt, an elderly relation who had attended the previous night's dinner and had wasted no time carrying the story to Lady Ashworth over morning tea. "I do not know what has happened," Lady Ashworth said, settling into a chair with visible tension, "but I intend to find out. This family did not travel all this way, did not spend a fortune preparing you both for this opportunity, only to watch it slip away to the one daughter who was never meant to be part of the arrangement at all." "Mother," Eleanor said carefully, "perhaps it was never truly an arrangement to begin with. Perhaps the Duke simply responded to whatever felt most genuine to him, and none of us can control that, however carefully we plan." Lady Ashworth's eyes narrowed at this uncharacteristic softness from her usually pragmatic eldest daughter. "You would simply allow this to happen, without a fight?" "I do not know what fight there is to be had," Eleanor admitted, against a man's honest feelings. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and Clara herself entered, unaware of the storm of emotion that had gathered in her absence, carrying a small basket of fresh flowers she had gathered from the garden that morning for the breakfast table. She paused in the doorway, sensing immediately that something was wrong from the strained silence that greeted her arrival. "Is something the matter?" she asked, glancing between her mother and sisters. For a long moment, no one answered, until Lady Ashworth finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "We have heard, Clara, that you were seen walking privately with the Duke last night, during the dinner party. Is this true?" Clara felt her stomach tighten, understanding immediately the source of the tension in the room. "It is true," she said honestly, seeing no purpose in denial. "He asked to speak with me privately, and I agreed. We spoke for only a short time, on the terrace, within view of the house the entire time. Nothing improper occurred, I promise you that." "That is not what concerns me," Lady Ashworth said. "What concerns me is what was said between you." Clara hesitated, uncertain how much to share, aware that whatever she said next might reshape the delicate balance of her family in ways she could not fully predict. "He spoke of his own feelings," she said finally, choosing her words with care. "He did not make any formal declaration, Mother. He said only that he found himself thinking of me often, in ways he had not expected." The room fell silent once more, Eleanor and Margaret exchanging a brief, unreadable glance, while Lady Ashworth studied her youngest daughter with an expression that mixed disbelief, calculation, and something else, something almost like reluctant pride, though it was tangled too tightly with disappointment to fully emerge. "I never sought this," Clara said quietly, addressing her sisters directly now. "I want you both to know that. I did not come to this house intending to draw his attention away from either of you. I have spent this entire week trying to stay exactly where I have always stayed, in the background, out of the way. Whatever has happened, it was never my intention to cause either of you pain." Margaret was the first to respond, her expression softening despite her own disappointment. "I believe you, Clara. I do not think you have ever once tried to compete with us for anything, not in your entire life. That has always simply been your way." She paused, then added, more quietly, "Perhaps that is precisely why it worked, when nothing either of us tried seemed to make the same impression." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, wrestling visibly with her own pride, before finally rising from her chair and crossing the room to where Clara stood, still holding her small basket of flowers. "I will not pretend this does not disappoint me," Eleanor said stiffly. "I have wanted this match, wanted it for the security it would offer our family, wanted it, I confess, for my own sake as well. But I will not blame you for something you never sought, Clara. That would be neither fair nor honest, and whatever else I am, I have always tried to be honest." Clara felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes at her sister's words, and the two embraced briefly, an unfamiliar gesture between them, before Eleanor stepped back, composing herself once more into her usual careful poise. "Nothing has been decided," Clara said softly, looking between her mother and sisters. "He has made no formal offer. Whatever happens next remains uncertain for all of us." But even as she spoke the words, some quiet part of her understood that the course of the week ahead had already begun to shift in a direction none of them, least of all Clara herself, had ever thought to expect. The 8th day dawned bright and clear. The storm of the previous days finally passed, and with it came a strange, watchful stillness over Kensmere Hall, as though the entire household understood that something important was approaching, even if no one dared name it aloud. Clara woke early, unable to sleep past dawn, her mind still turning over the conversation with her mother and sisters, and the deeper conversation with the Duke that had preceded it. She dressed simply and made her way outside before breakfast, drawn toward the gardens where she had first noticed how much care had gone into their design, hoping that the quiet beauty of the roses and the winding paths might settle her restless thoughts. She did not expect to encounter anyone else so early, and so she was surprised, though not entirely so, to find the Duke already there, standing near the same stone bridge where they had first spoken during the garden tour on her second day at the house. "You are awake early," he said, turning as she approached. "I could not sleep," Clara admitted. "There has been a great deal to think about these past 2 days." "Yes," the Duke agreed. "I imagine there has been." He gestured toward a bench nearby, half hidden beneath the branches of an old oak tree. "Will you sit with me a while? I find I have been waiting for the right moment to speak more fully of what has been in my heart, and I do not believe there will ever be a perfectly right moment. Perhaps this morning, with the garden quiet, and no one else awake to interrupt us, will have to do." Clara sat beside him, her heart beginning to beat faster, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I have thought a great deal, these past days, about what I am truly searching for in a wife," the Duke began, his voice thoughtful and unhurried. "When I first considered ending my years of solitude and finally seeking a marriage, I believed I wanted someone capable, someone who could manage a household of this size with intelligence and skill. Your sister Eleanor possesses that quality in great measure, and I do not say that to diminish her in any way. She would make a formidable duchess, in her own right, for the right man." Clara listened quietly, unsure where this reflection was leading, though she felt no jealousy in his words, only genuine respect. "I also believed," the Duke continued, "that I might want someone who could bring warmth and laughter back into these halls, someone who could soften the formality that has settled over this house since my father's passing. Your sister Margaret carries that gift effortlessly, and I have enjoyed her company this week more than I expected to enjoy anyone's." "They are both remarkable," Clara said softly, meaning every word. "They are," the Duke agreed. "And yet, Miss Clara, in all my careful planning, in all my expectations about what qualities I should seek in a wife, I never once considered, that what I truly longed for was simply to be seen, honestly and without performance, by someone who wanted nothing from me but my own genuine self. I did not know, until this week, how rare that particular gift truly is. He turned to face her fully then, his expression earnest, in a way Clara had not seen from him before. All the careful reserve of their earlier conversations finally set aside. You have never once asked me for anything, Clara. Not attention, not favor, not even friendship. You have simply been present, honest, and kind, in every quiet moment, when you believed no one was watching. And in doing so, you have shown me more of what a true partnership might feel like than any conversation about estate management or any evening of laughter ever could. Clara's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the sincerity of his words. I do not say this to press you for an answer you are not ready to give, the Duke continued gently. I understand that this has all happened quickly, and that you came to this house never expecting to be part of any courtship at all. I only wished you to know, fully and honestly, what has grown in my heart these past 8 days, so that whatever choice lies ahead, you would understand it was never born of impulse, but of genuine and careful feeling. Your Grace, Clara finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. I do not know how to explain what these past days have meant to me either. I came here believing myself invisible, believing that quality had always been simply a fact of my nature, something I had long ago accepted without question. I never imagined that someone might see that same quietness, not as something lacking, but as something worth noticing. I do not know what the future holds, but I know that I do not wish to pretend, even for a moment, that what has grown between us these past days means nothing to me. It means a very great deal. The Duke reached out, gently taking her hand in his, and for a long moment they sat together beneath the old oak tree, the morning light filtering softly through its branches, neither of them speaking, simply allowing the quiet truth of the moment to settle between them. There is one more thing I must ask you, the Duke said finally, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability in his words. Before I speak with your mother, before anything becomes formal or official, I wish to ask you directly, honestly, as one person to another, without titles or expectations weighing upon the question. Clara, do you believe you could find happiness here, in this quiet house, as my wife, not as a duchess with duties and responsibilities, but simply as my equal, my companion, the person I would wish to share every quiet morning with, for the rest of my life? Clara looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and finding none, she finally allowed herself to answer with the same honesty he had offered her. Yes, she said softly. I believe I could. I believe, in truth, I already have begun to. The Duke's expression broke into a smile, unlike any Clara had seen from him during her entire visit, a smile free of formality or careful reserve, simply the genuine joy of a man who had, after 3 long years of solitude, finally found what he had not known he was searching for. Then I will speak with your mother today, he said, properly, formally, as is expected. But I wanted you to hear it first, from me, in this quiet garden, before anything else is said or decided by anyone else. Clara nodded, unable to fully express the swell of emotion rising within her, and together they sat a while longer beneath the old oak tree, watching the morning light grow stronger over the gardens, neither of them speaking further, content simply to share the quiet, the very quality that had brought them together in the first place. Neither of them noticed, in that private moment, a curtain shifting slightly in an upstairs window of the house, where Eleanor stood watching the scene below, with an expression that had, somewhere over the past 2 days, settled from disappointment into something quieter and more accepting, a private acknowledgement that some things could not be won through effort alone, no matter how carefully planned, and that perhaps, in the end, that understanding was its own kind of peace. The Duke requested a private audience with Lord and Lady Ashworth that very afternoon, and word of the meeting spread through the household with the same quiet speed as the rumor that had preceded it days earlier. Clara waited in her room, too nervous to sit still, pacing slowly from the window to the door and back again, while somewhere below, in the Duke's study, her future was being discussed in terms far more formal than anything that had passed between herself and Sebastian Hargrove in the quiet garden that morning. Lord Ashworth, a man of few words who had spent the entire visit largely in the background, listened carefully as the Duke explained, with evident sincerity, his growing feelings for Clara and his wish to seek her hand in marriage, should her family and Clara herself consent to the match. Lady Ashworth, though she had suspected this outcome for the better part of 2 days, found herself still momentarily speechless upon hearing it spoken so plainly and formally. "You understand," Lady Ashworth said finally, once she had recovered her composure, "that Clara was never raised or prepared for a position such as this. She has no training in managing a household of this size, no experience with the social demands that will be placed upon a duchess. Eleanor, or even Margaret, would come to you far better equipped for such responsibilities." "I understand that concern," the Duke replied evenly, "and I do not dismiss it. But I have watched Clara this past week manage difficulties with a grace and competence that no amount of formal training could teach. She mended a broken heirloom with her own hands, rather than see a servant girl punished unfairly. She noticed the comfort of every person in this house, guest and servant alike, without ever once being asked to do so. I do not believe household management is a skill Clara lacks, Lady Ashworth. I believe it is simply a skill she has never before been given the opportunity to display in a setting large enough to notice it." Lord Ashworth, who had remained quiet throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke, his voice carrying the particular weight of a father who rarely offered his opinion, but meant every word when he did. "I have watched my youngest daughter go largely unnoticed in our own household for many years, Your Grace. Not through any unkindness on our part, but simply because she has never demanded the attention her sisters naturally draw. If you have seen in her the qualities we perhaps overlooked too easily ourselves, then I find I have no objection to this match. Indeed, I find myself rather moved that someone has finally seen her clearly." Lady Ashworth, still processing the sudden and unexpected turn her careful plans had taken, allowed herself a long moment of silence, before finally nodding, her expression softening from its earlier surprise into something closer to genuine, if reluctant, happiness. "Then I will not stand in the way of it," she said, "though I confess, Your Grace, I never once imagined, when I accepted your invitation, that it would be Clara we would leave this house celebrating." "Nor did I," the Duke admitted, a small smile touching his features. "I believe that is precisely why it feels so right." Word of the formal consent reached Clara within the hour, delivered by her mother herself, who entered Clara's room with an expression Clara had never quite seen on her mother's face before, a complicated mixture of surprise, pride, and something gentler that Clara could only describe as a kind of tearful wonder. "He has asked for your hand," Lady Ashworth said simply, "and your father and I have given our consent. The final decision, of course, rests with you, Clara, though I suspect you have already made it, in that quiet garden this morning." Clara felt tears rising once more, and this time she did not try to hold them back. "I have," she admitted softly. "I have made my decision, Mother, and I hope, in time, you will understand that this was never something I sought or schemed for. It simply happened, in the quietest, most unexpected way." Lady Ashworth crossed the room and embraced her youngest daughter, holding her tightly for a long moment. "I understand that now," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "I have spent so many years believing that the loudest voice in a room, the most striking beauty, the sharpest wit, were the qualities that would secure a family's future. I never once considered that quiet kindness, offered without any expectation of reward, might prove the most powerful quality of all. I am sorry, Clara, that it has taken me this long to see what has been in front of me your entire life." Clara held her mother close, overwhelmed by the unexpected tenderness of the moment, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt not invisible, not overlooked, but fully and completely seen, not only by the Duke, but by her own family as well. That evening, the family gathered once more for dinner, though this time, the atmosphere in the grand dining room had shifted entirely from the careful, competitive tension of the previous nights into something warmer and more genuine. Eleanor, though still working through her own private disappointment, offered Clara a sincere and steady congratulations, her earlier bitterness having settled, over the course of the day, into something closer to genuine acceptance and, eventually, real happiness for her youngest sister. Margaret, ever warm-hearted despite her own quiet sorrow, embraced Clara tightly before dinner began, whispering that she had always known, somewhere in her heart, that Clara possessed a quality neither she nor Eleanor could ever quite compete against, though she had never expected it to reveal itself in quite this way. The Duke, seated at the head of the table, found his eyes returning again and again to Clara throughout the meal, no longer with the careful, searching curiosity of the earlier days, but with the open, settled warmth of a man who had finally found what he had spent 3 long years believing he might never find at all. As dinner drew to a close, and the family prepared to retire for the evening, the Duke rose from his seat and lifted his glass, drawing the attention of everyone at the table. "I wish to make an announcement," he said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "Though the formal arrangements will follow in the proper time, I wish everyone present tonight to know that Miss Clara Ashworth has agreed to become my wife, and I do not believe I have ever felt more certain of any decision in my entire life." A round of warm congratulations followed, servants pausing in the doorways to smile and offer quiet well wishes of their own, having grown fond of Clara's kindness over the course of her short stay, and Clara, sitting at the table surrounded by her family, felt for the first time in her life that she was not simply present in the room, but truly, fully, part of it. The wedding took place 3 months later, in the small stone chapel on the grounds of Kensmere Hall, a building far more modest than the grand estate surrounding it, chosen deliberately by Clara herself, who had insisted from the very beginning that she wanted no grand cathedral in London, no enormous gathering of strangers eager to witness a duke's marriage for the sake of gossip and spectacle. She wanted only the people who truly mattered, gathered in a quiet, familiar place, to witness the beginning of a life she had never once imagined for herself. The chapel was filled with early autumn light, streaming softly through narrow stained-glass windows and casting gentle patterns of color across the stone floor. Eleanor and Margaret stood together near the front, both dressed in matching gowns of soft gold, having fully embraced their roles as Clara's attendants over the preceding months, their earlier disappointment having transformed, through time and genuine affection, into real and unreserved joy for their sister's happiness. Lord and Lady Ashworth sat in the front pew, Lady Ashworth dabbing quietly at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony, unable to fully contain the emotion of watching her youngest daughter, so long overlooked, so quietly capable, finally step into a life that recognized and celebrated the very qualities that had once seemed, to the family, so unremarkable. Alice, the young kitchen maid whose broken dish had first revealed Clara's quiet kindness to the household so many months before, stood near the back of the chapel among the household staff who had been invited to attend, her eyes bright with tears of her own, having grown genuinely fond of the young woman who had knelt beside her that stormy night, without a moment's hesitation. When Clara appeared at the entrance of the chapel, dressed simply, but elegantly, in a gown of pale ivory, without the elaborate embellishments that might have suited a more showy occasion, a hush fell over the small gathered crowd. She walked down the short aisle on her father's arm, her expression calm and steady, none of the nervous uncertainty that had marked her arrival at Kensmere Hall so many months earlier visible in her bearing now. The Duke waited for her at the front of the chapel, and as she drew closer, his own composed expression broke into a smile so genuine, so unguarded, that several among the gathered guests found themselves quietly moved by the simple honesty of it, a reminder that whatever grandeur surrounded this occasion, at its heart lay something far simpler and far more precious than any title or estate could provide. The ceremony itself was brief and unadorned, exactly as Clara had wished, the vows exchanged in clear, steady voices that carried easily through the small stone chapel. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, a soft murmur of happiness rippled through the gathered crowd, and Clara, looking up into the Duke's eyes as he gently lifted her veil, felt a wave of quiet, overwhelming joy, unlike anything she had experienced in her entire life. Afterward, a modest celebration was held in the gardens of Kensmere Hall, the same gardens where Clara had first helped a struggling gardener carry his heavy crate, where she had first spoken honestly with the Duke about her own uncertain place in the world, where their quiet understanding had first begun to take root. Tables had been arranged beneath the old willow trees near the lake, and the late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden light over the entire gathering. Eleanor found a quiet moment during the celebration to approach Clara, drawing her sister aside near the edge of the lake. "I want you to know," Eleanor said, her voice sincere, in a way that had not always come naturally to her, "that I have thought a great deal, these past months, about everything that happened here this past spring, I came to this house believing that intelligence and ambition were the surest paths to happiness, and in some ways, I still believe that. But watching you these past months, watching how naturally happiness has settled into your life, without any of the striving I have always relied upon, has taught me something I did not expect to learn. I am truly, deeply happy for you, Clara, and I find I am grateful, too, for what you have shown me. Clara embraced her sister warmly, moved by the honesty of her words. You have always been remarkable in your own way, Eleanor. I have no doubt that your own happiness, whatever form it takes, is waiting for you as surely as mine found me here. Margaret joined them a moment later, slipping an arm around each of her sisters, and the three stood together near the lake, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. The tension and competition of those early days at Kensmere Hall, having long since given way to something far more valuable, a bond between sisters that had, in the end, only grown stronger through the unexpected turns their shared journey had taken. As evening settled over the gardens, the Duke found Clara standing alone for a moment, near the same stone bridge where their quiet friendship had first begun to take shape, and he came to stand beside her, taking her hand gently in his. "Do you remember," he said softly, "the first evening you arrived, when I found you in that small sitting room, and you told me you were not very good at conversation?" Clara smiled, recalling the memory clearly. "I remember it well. I believed it entirely true at the time. I am glad you were wrong," the Duke said, "though I have come to understand, over these past months, that it was never truly about conversation at all. It was about honesty, about kindness offered without expectation, about the quiet courage it takes to remain simply and completely oneself, even when the world around you seems determined to overlook that particular kind of strength." Clara leaned against him gently, watching the last light of the day fade slowly across the water. "I never imagined," she said quietly, "that the quiet corners of my life, the places where no one thought to look, would be exactly where someone finally found me. I did not imagine it either," the Duke admitted, "until the moment I truly began to look." Together, they stood beneath the darkening sky, the sounds of the celebration continuing softly behind them, two people who had found, in the most unexpected and quiet of ways, exactly what they had not known they were searching for. A partnership built not on performance or competition, but on the simple, enduring truth of being genuinely seen and genuinely loved, for exactly who they were. And in the years that followed, as Kensmere Hall slowly filled once more with warmth and laughter, with the sound of children's footsteps echoing through halls that had once felt so silent, those who remembered the story of the three sisters and the quiet woman who poured the tea would often say that theirs was not a tale of grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but something far rarer and far more lasting, a love built patiently, quietly, in the smallest and most honest moments of everyday kindness, the kind of love that, once found, never truly fades.